Let's jump into some fintech stories outside of Walmart. The first one that I wanted to talk about is one I haven't really spent too much time digging into, so I thought it'd be a good excuse for the podcast, but it's sort of a rising trend of reimbursements within the world of P2P payments and faster payments. So a couple parts to this news story. The first is that the UK's payment systems regulator has confirmed plans that they've been talking about for a while to improve protections for victims of authorized push payments fraud, which is a very, very common type of fraud within the UK payment system, which will come into force in October of 2024, which is this year. I am still not quite used to that, but I guess October of this year is when it will come into effect. It's being described as kind of a step change in fraud protection, which essentially will mean that the vast majority of money that's lost in this APP fraud, which again is very, very common, will actually be reimbursed, and that consumers and other eligible groups for reimbursement will have I think a lifetime maximum reimbursement of up to £415,000 to get reimbursed. So they're putting a lot more liability on the financial institutions. And what's interesting is that essentially it's kind of the same as it is in the US with Zelle or any of these other types of payment scams. If you are tricked into authorizing a payment that was sort of a trick conducted by a fraudster or a scammer, you can essentially report that and request reimbursement. And unless there's a very specific set of conditions where the payment service provider can push back, if the customer has acted with gross negligence, and the burden for showing gross negligence is on the payment service provider. If the customer has acted fraudulently, so if it's first-party fraud, and again, the PSP can prove that, or in the case of unlawful payments or civil disputes, those are areas where the payment service provider can push back. But unless it meets one of those requirements, the payment service provider is in fact required to reimburse the customer. And interestingly, for the first time, the payment service provider that facilitated the sending of the payment will be able to get 50% of the reimbursed amount from the payment company or financial institution that accepted or received the payment. So they're trying to split the pain evenly between the sender and receiver, which is quite a change from how things have typically worked. So that's happening in the UK. And at the same time, you might remember late last year, it was reported that Zelle and Early Warning Services, which runs Zelle, had introduced a change for a very specific type of fraud within the Zelle ecosystem. So this is the sort of impersonation scam where you pretend to be a bank or a government agency or whatever, and you trick a customer into authorizing a payment. The banks that participate in Zelle are now actually reimbursing customers for these imposter scams as well. And somewhat similar to what they're doing in the UK, the mechanism that they're using to do this is not actually a reimbursement by the sending financial institution, but rather a clawing back of the money from the receiving institution. So the customer is made whole, but the money is actually clawed back by the sending institution to the institution that received it within the Zelle network. So all of these changes, whether they're introduced by regulation or in the US, are being done sort of proactively by the financial institutions themselves. I guess, Jason, the thing that occurs to me about this is this all seems to be the result of just mounting public pressure around just sort of frustration with these scams. A lot of noise made by politicians and policymakers, and finally seeing some movement here. What's your sort of big takeaway from seeing this change? Is faster payments and P2P payments safe now? Is that the takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, these types of fraud and scams, are not inherently new. I mean, the vector, right? So whether it's, Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, like that method is sort of the novel piece here. And I think that is opening up an avenue for both regulators and politicians to apply pressure, right? So as you were sort of like summarizing the new developments, I was kind of thinking like, okay, what are some of the fundamental differences as a payment mechanism? If you're doing an ACH debit or a card payment, typically like that's making a payment to a merchant. Not that that couldn't potentially be a fraud or a scam, but
Yep.
then the protections set up by EFTA Reg E, provide a fairly clear framework and liability for how to handle those things.
Hmm.
Granted, I know that there is a lot of hand wringing lately over the card dispute process sort of not being fit for purpose. It's slow, it's expensive, it's manual, it doesn't work, etc. But I mean, there's a framework for handling this. In the sort of impersonation space, and sadly at multiple employers I've worked for, it's been a problem where the company I worked for was impersonated in one of a classic variant of these, the advanced payment loan scam, right? So somebody potentially because they've applied through a lead generator site or their information is out there, get a phone call. Hey, I'm calling from lending company X. Good news. You've been approved for $3,000. I
Yeah.
just need you to send me whatever, $100 payment processing fee.
Right.
And typically that would be done by back in the day, having them get like a green dot money pack card and be like, oh, I just need you to read the code on the back to me. And then once they've done that, the money's gone. There's no way to trace it. Also the sort of whatever IRS impersonation scams. I mean, to
Yep.
me, the key difference here is, the payment rail, the mechanism. And because it is, particularly in the case of Zelle, operated by a bank-owned consortium, which is always, tends to be a favorite punching bag these days. It's quite a bit easier for politicians and regulators to point at something like Zelle, which is if not directly bank owned, de facto bank owned, and say you guys need to figure this out. Versus some of these other problems that we've seen in the past, or frankly even with Venmo and Cash App, which are again sort of like bank adjacent. But as far as where they can bring pressure to bear, it seems to be falling on Zelle, and then perhaps Cash App and Venmo and other payment processors sort of feel the need to follow what's happening in the market, even if it's not a specific regulatory obligation.